cover today is are we going to record this session before we get going?
Yeah, just starting.
Awesome.
Looks like it just started.
Thanks. Cool. So what we're going to cover today is what is product design and user-centered design? What does the design process look like, and why UCD or user-centered design is important? I'll be asking for some light participation in the Zoom chat as we go, so keep an eye out for that. So to start off with a quick introduction, my name is Morgan Hoos. I'm a product designer. I've worked primarily in the DoD and have had the opportunity to work on two major applications that you see in the center of the screen there, both Jigsaw, the tanker planning tool, and Slapshot, the master air attack planning tool, that they're both being currently used at the 609th Air Operations Center today. Now I work as a product design coach, so I'm teaching others what I've learned and helping them navigate through the design process in the DoD as well as other highly regulated areas. So starting off with a quick question in the chat, what do you think of when you hear the term product designer? Well, pretty pictures, building useful things. I would hope so. What else? I like calling out research. That's really important. POC for coordinating outcomes. Nice. Making it look good. House decorations. Yeah, great. So I think the first thing that often comes to mind is very visual for people. So we're thinking about like the fonts, the colors, the layouts, anything you would see in a GUI or a UI. And although the designer is responsible for all of the visual pretty aspects of an application or an experience, it doesn't always have to be a digital application. That only really scratches the surface into what their responsibilities look like. So most often you'll find a product designer within a balanced team. So a balanced team is a model that structures a product team who's building an application or experience into three parts. So you're going to have your product manager, your product designer, and your engineering team. So the product designer is the user advocate. So they're responsible for the end-to-end design process and identifying the user needs, from the user needs to testing and evaluating a solution. So we're really responsible for having an intimate understanding of our user and their problems. And it goes a lot deeper than just like the pretty UI that the users will see. So we're truly problem solvers at the core. We look at the user's pains and problems that they're facing, and we think of all the different ways that we can create an experience that's highly usable and accessible for whatever context that they're in. So once we've settled on a solution, we've validated it with users, we know that it's going to work for them. That's when we hand it off to the product manager. And the PM is the business advocate. So they're creating and prioritizing user stories to be built by the developers. And they're doing this based on user needs as well as stakeholder needs, and they're driving the product direction. So from there, they give it to the engineers and they come in and kind of make the magic happen. So the engineers are the advocates for the health of the code base. So they're responsible for implementing new features in a way that's secure and reliable and sustainable. And they're also on the watch for tech debt that might need to be addressed in the app. So they'll build the features based on the design and the user stories from the product manager. So this just illustrates how a product team that is following the balanced team model will function. However, oftentimes a balanced team is a luxury that you just won't have. So the good news is that user-centered design, which we're going to get into in a second here, is a mindset that can be adopted by anyone that's involved in the development process. So not just the designers. So what is user-centered design? Let's start by looking at this very formal definition. This comes from the Interaction Design Foundation, which is a great resource. And it reads, user-centered design is an iterative design process in which designers focus on the users and their needs in each phase of their process. Users are involved via a variety of research and design techniques to create highly usable and accessible products for them. So remember, designers, we are in the business of solving problems. So UCD is not a technique that's exclusive to designers, although this definition does say design 5 times. But anyone can and should use UCD as an approach to their problems. So this definition is not inaccurate by any means, but I want to challenge the narrowness of it because I believe UCD can be applied to any problem, task, or output, like anything that has an end user that's affected by the decision. So let's reimagine this in a bit of a broader sense, taking designers kind of out of the equation. So what we're left with is my definition of user-centered design, which reads, user-centered design is an iterative process for solving problems in which focus is on the users and their needs in each phase of the process. Users are involved via a variety of research techniques to create highly usable and accessible products for them. So this feels a lot better to me because it allows us to explore the value of UCD beyond just being a designer. So it gives us the freedom to approach any problem using these techniques. Now, I think it's worth mentioning the difference between user-centered design and human-centered design. You'll often hear these used interchangeably, but there's a subtle difference that I want to call out. And that is that users are a subset of humans, right? So your user base is going to be like a smaller subset of just the general human population. So all users are humans, but not all of the humans in the world are going to be your users. So human-centered design considers the general behaviors of humans as a broad population, whereas user-centered design requires a deeper analysis of users and your target audience. And it's not only about the general characteristics about what makes a person, but also the particular habits and context that your user is in. And this is really important for coming up with the right solutions for their specific problems. This is especially important in the DoD, where our users are warfighters. So they're dealing with high stress, high stakes decisions that the average person may never see in their lifetime. So it's important to be user-centered in our context because our users are a very unique subset of the human population. So what does the design process actually look like? That was kind of the formal definition of like what UCD is. But what we're going to do is we're going to watch a quick video where Don Norman talks about an example of bad design. Don Norman is the co-founder of the Nielsen Norman Group, which is an incredible resource that's established a lot of the best practices and techniques that designers use today. So this is kind of looked at as like the hands down version of like what designers should do. They put out a lot of great educational resources. He's also the author of The Design of Everyday Things, which is a book that simplifies the design process and advocates for usability that's just as important as the aesthetics. So as we watch the clip of him talking about this poor design, think of other apps, features, or experiences that you've seen that are similar to the bad doors example that he gives. Okay, I'm gonna have to reshare. It's not letting me play it in presenter mode. One quick moment.
There's this door on the 10th floor of the Vox Media office that I hate so much. Hi, Joe. Hey, I'm Don Norman. Gee, you know, it's hard to describe what I am.
Well, he's been a professor of psychology, professor of cognitive science, professor of computer science, a vice president of advanced technology at Apple. But for our purposes.
I was spending a year in England. I got so frustrated with my inability to use the light switches and the water taps and the doors even, that I wrote this book. If I continually get a door wrong, is it my fault? No. In fact, if you continually get it wrong, it's a good, but if other people continue to get it wrong, good sign that it's a really bad door.
A Norman door is one where the design tells you to do the opposite of what you're actually supposed to do, or gives the wrong signal and needs a sign to correct it.
Why does it need an instruction manual? That is, why do you have to have a sign that says push or pull? Why not make it obvious?
It can be obvious if it's designed right.
There are a couple of really simple, basic principles of design, and one of them I'll call discoverability. When I look at something, I should be able to discover what operations I can do.
The principle applies to a whole lot more than doors.
And it's amazing with many of our computer systems today. You look at it, there's no way of knowing what's possible. Should I tap it once or twice or even triple tap? So discoverability, when it's not there, well, you don't know how to use something.
Another is feedback.
And so many times there's no feedback. You have no idea what happened or why it happened.
And these principles form the basis of how designers and engineers work today, commonly known as user or human-centered design.
I decided at one point the word user was a bit degrading. Why not call people people? And it's amazingly simple and amazingly seldom practiced. We call it iterative. It goes around in a circle. We go out and we observe what is happening today. We observe people doing the task. And from that, we say, oh, we have some ideas. Here's what we should perhaps propose to do.
Then you prototype your solution and test it.
Quite often these are wrong at first, but each time we go around the circle, we do a better job of making the device until the point we're actually making something that really works.
And this process has spread all over the world.
And it turns out it's improving lives.
From better everyday things like the ones that Don wrote about,
To using the same process to solve huge problems in public health in developing countries,
water,
sanitation,
farming.
lots more. So would be a better human-centered door?
An ideal door is one that as I walk up to it and walk through it, I'm not even aware that I had opened the door and shut it. So if you had a door which had a flat plate, what could you do? Nothing. The only thing you can do is push. That's it. You wouldn't need a sign. Flat plate, you push.
This kind of push bar with the piece sticking out on one side works well too. So you can see what side you're supposed to push on.
Vertical bars could go either way. A simple little hand thing, though, sort of indicates, oh,
But we still have terrible, terrible doors in the world. So many of them.
there are lots of things in life that are fairly standardized, and therefore, whether I buy this house or not is not a function of whether it has good doors in it. And so, except for safety reasons, doors tend not to be improved.
But the tyranny of bad doors must end.
Cool. So for our purposes, we're just going to stop it there. And let me reshare. But as I do that, in the chat, what is some examples of other poor user experiences that you've seen? Can't labels and parking signs, Netflix auto playing a preview. That is like highly criticized for sure. Cool. What else? Ammo cans for the Pave Hawk helicopter. Also, if you want to say a come off mute and say an example, feel free to. Yeah, why are printers so hard to use? I feel like they should be way easier by now. A lot of highways. Yep. All great examples. Now, when we say bad design or poor design here, what we're referring to is like the need for that additional explanation of how to go about accomplishing a task. Like Don said, he's like, it shouldn't need a user manual. I should just walk up and walk through the door and not even think about it. So a good design experience is often one that you don't even notice. And what's funny about bad design is it's often things that society has just come to accept. Like for example, another poor design experience is the USB that we never seem to plug in the right way on the first try. It's always like the third or fourth for me. The 20-minute connection time between flights where you're rushing through the airport, or when you're in the grocery store trying to check out with produce and you need the little sticker, but the sticker's gone, and it's just like a whole process. But we've just kind of like come to accept it. Like, why have these things not been resolved, right? But when we look at good design, like I said, good design often goes unnoticed. It's those experiences where everything just happens exactly when and how you need it to happen. So when you think to yourself, wow, I really wish I could do X in this situation, and the tool you're using just lets you do it seamlessly and easily, exactly how you want it, that's a really good design. So some examples of that could be the Swiss Army knife, this compact tool that has like 10 plus functions, easily fits in your pocket. It's so iconic that the term the Swiss Army knife has been coined as someone who can do it all, right? Another example is the humble Google homepage where you go to Google search something and there's no question of how you do it, right? Like the search bar is right there, smack dab in the center. You don't have to think, you can just go in and accomplish the task that you need to do. Another example is Disneyland, where they basically took the unpleasantness of standing in long lines for rides, and they've created this experience out of it. So they have characters walking through the lines, they're entertaining you as you do it. So they took this thing that's like inherently unenjoyable and tried to make it this enjoyable experience through different means. So I want to pause here for questions. Are there any questions from the group on anything we've talked about so far? Cool. If not, we'll keep going. So now that we've looked at the definition of UCD and what a good experience looks like, let's talk about what it means to incorporate UCD into the design process. Dawn talked a little bit about it in that video we just watched. But essentially, it's using user research throughout your process and talking to users through it. So at its core, UCD uses user research to reduce risk and evaluate success of a product or an experience. So there's many different research techniques, but I want to highlight the three most common ones here. So contextual inquiry is observing your user's process on site in their environment. So this is where you actually go and you're sitting in the seat next to them, you're watching them do their thing, and you're just kind of observing their process. There's a ton you can learn from doing this. Oftentimes when you ask someone about their experience and watch them do the actual process, you get very different insights. So it's important to kind of do both. User interviews, I'm going to call them our Swiss Army knife of user research. So they're structured conversations that include open-ended, non-leading questions. So there's definitely a process for preparing for a user interview, but these can be used in a variety of different environments, both in person or remote, and they can kind of be used in any phase of the process, which we're going to talk about. Finally, usability testing involves observing your users try to accomplish their tasks in whatever your proposed solution is. So you've identified a problem and then you're proposing something and trying to evaluate the success of it. Like, is it actually usable? That's where usability testing comes in. So when we look at the kind of design process, as well as like the problem solving process, we start by exploring and identifying a problem to solve. From there, we're going to ideate on ways that we think we can solve that problem. And we're going to test some solutions to that problem. This is where that iterative cycle that Dawn talked about comes in. So you go back and forth between the ideation and testing phase, because like as you ideate, you come up with an idea, a solution, you test it, it's like not quite right or a little bit off, you go back to ideation and you retest. And every time you go through that cycle, you get a little bit closer to that really innovative solution that users need. And then finally, we evaluate. So once we've decided like, okay, this solution is the right one, we put it out and we want to measure success on like, is it truly, were all of our hypotheses correct? And where our research methods come in is there's a lot of overlap. It's not a one size fits all. It's kind of choosing whatever is best for the phase and problem that you're facing. But contextual inquiry is typically used in the explore and ideation phase. In the beginning here, we're learning about the problem. We're just observing our users. We're trying to understand what they're going through. User interviews, like I said, are the Swiss Army knife. We can use these throughout the whole thing. However, they're often found in like the ideation and testing phase where we're asking users like, how should we solve this problem? We're testing it with them, that sort of thing. And then usability testing, like I said, is used for evaluation. Like, is our solution actually usable? So let's look at a case study of UCD in action. So in 2005, Samsung primarily designed their TVs with technical specs in mind. So they were looking at high quality picture and sound, and that was like the most important focus for them. But Samsung representatives visited people in different countries to observe how they were actually using their TV, because they were trying to get kind of on the cutting edge of the TV industry. So they talked to people about how they use TVs in their homes, and what they found was really surprising. So people viewed TVs as like a piece of furniture. The TV was off like most of the time, except for when you're watching it. So people didn't want it to dominate their living room or take up all this space. So rather than showing off their expensive TV with all of its technological capabilities, they would like hide it away, which is not what Samsung originally thought about how people interacted with it. So what they did was they changed their design strategy radically. They moved the speakers to make the TV slimmer. They started balancing the technical capabilities with the design choices that made TVs fit more seamlessly into the lives of their users. And by 2007, they had doubled its share in the global TV market because they had kind of proven to understand what users needed and what was relevant to their customers. Since then, they've been kind of following along the same research insight of allowing televisions to fit seamlessly into the homes of people. And most recently in 2017, releasing their popular Samsung Frame TV, which looks like a piece of art. You wouldn't even be able to tell that it was a TV. Pause real quick for questions. Anything? Questions or comments on what we've talked about? Cool. So, Chris, how frequently would you recommend reaching out to users? That's a great question. I think it really depends on like where you are in the design process. But what Nielsen and Norman recommends is 3 to 5 user interviews can kind of identify like a ton of the usability problems or like insights that you're going to gain from a larger population. So I would say like as you're approaching a new problem or like solving it with a solution, I would look to try to get like at least 3 to 5 perspectives on like what you're trying to solve. I think it's best to do it ad hoc, like as you need research, rather than like reaching out to users just, you know, frequently, but without like real focus on what you need from them, if that makes sense.
Hey, Morgan, a quick question. I was thinking about this Samsung example, right? Like, how do you balance the kind of research and insights you get from your user interviews or user research and couple that with like the reality of the world or your own expertise and that sort of thing? Because in the Samsung example, in 2003, you can want to put that on your wall all you want, but like the technology just literally wasn't there in order to do that. So I would imagine the designers had to be looking ahead to changes coming in technology and kind of trying to extract out user needs that they don't even know they have yet. And how do you think about those sorts of things?
Yeah, I talk about this a little bit towards the end of the presentation, but I think it's a great question. And my opinion on it is, as the designer, you are the expert, or not the designer, it doesn't have to be a designer, but the person building the solution, you're the expert on what is possible, right? Like, you know, the technology available to you, you know what you can build. The user doesn't always know that. So it's a balance between talking to them about their problems, understanding what is possible, and finding that like innovative middle ground where you can deliver something that solves their pains or, you know, helps with the problem that they're solving. And we saw with the Samsung case study that it was from 2005 to 2017, right? Where they ended up with this like really beautiful frame TV that I would say is like the epitome of solving that user problem of fitting into their home. So it can often take like, you're right in that like technology is often a limiting factor of what you can build at the time, but it's iterative. So they started by just making it slimmer, and then we eventually got to this 2017 example. Any other thoughts or comments on that? Cool. Okay, so next we're going to talk about UCD, why UCD is important. So we've talked about what it is, kind of how it works in the process, but why does it matter? So the most basic reason is that UCD reduces risk. So this visual is illustrating the difference between a waterfall project in which requirements are defined at the beginning of the product and then built to until it's delivered. However, what you can see is that like as your heads down working hard on building out these requirements, you're accumulating risk over time. And you're doing that by just not testing with users, not involving users in the process. So UCD can reduce this risk through incremental testing, which we can see with these little testing loops. So we build a little bit, we test with users, we evaluate our success, we build a little bit more, we test with users. And that makes sure that we are like on track to solving like the real problem at hand. So when we talk about risk, this can look a lot of different ways. It can be building under invalid assumptions. We think we know what the user needs. We just build to it, but it's actually not quite right. There's wasted time and effort on features that are not valuable or sometimes even provide negative value to users. There's increased chance of user error because we're not doing usability testing and identifying places where users can cause errors. And there's also risk of solving the wrong problem. Maybe we thought we knew what they needed, but it was actually something else. So an example I want to highlight is the Bradley fighting vehicle as an example of a combination of some of those risks we just highlighted. So the risk of solving the wrong problem, building under invalid assumptions, or wasting kind of time and effort on features that aren't as valuable. So HBO made a movie in 1998 called The Pentagon Wars. It was based on a book by Colonel James Burton, who was appointed by Congress to oversee the testing of the Bradley fighting vehicle when it was in development. So the project started with a very simple goal. It was to be a troop carrier transporting troops into combat. But by the end of the clip, Bradley turned into something that was like very far from its original goal. So Colonel Burton summarizes the Bradley project with this quote: "The finished Bradley is a troop transport that can't carry troops, a reconnaissance vehicle that's too conspicuous to do reconnaissance, and a quasi tank that has less armor than a snowblower, but carries enough ammo to take out half of DC." So I think it kind of sums it up that like this project just kind of went out of control. I've often heard blame placed on the product manager who was on the product. His name was Colonel Smith. He was responsible for the development. He's often criticized for his lack of like effective stakeholder management. He let too many kind of opinions drive the product and letting others just have input into the design. However, I think UCD would have played a really effective role at reducing the risk of this project becoming kind of out of hand and the result that it ended up being. Through frequent testing and evaluation and keeping the user in the loop, it would likely have kept the project closer to the real problem that they were trying to solve initially, which is to just be a troop carrier.
Morgan, did that evolution kind of happen out of interviews with users about what they were looking for? Or is that just kind of like the project going in a ton of random different directions?
So from what I found, like in the articles I read about it, and the criticism that the product manager got a lot is that he wasn't really working closely with the designer who would kind of advocate for like some of the risks that ended up, showing in like the final product. And it was often that like leadership had very strong opinions of what they wanted, and he was kind of just like letting that happen. So it's kind of a perfect storm, a combination of lots of reasons. But I believe that UCD would have helped kind of reduce that risk of it just snowballing into this tons of features piled onto this product.
Thank you.
Yep. So the other risk we talked about was user error. So looking at that, what's bothersome about this type of risk is the results can be really catastrophic and they're often preventable. So I'm sure everyone remembers the incident in 2018 where an employee in Hawaii pushed the wrong button and sent a ballistic missile threat alert to every resident. So this caused mass panic. People thought that a ballistic missile was incoming. And when we look at the UI of the wrong button that was pushed, it's easy to empathize with this employee. So this wasn't a user error, but like really the result of a poor user experience. So this was the option that they selected, and this was the option that should have been selected. So really the only thing that shows that it's like a drill versus not is that it says drill. So there's a lot like we could have done with this user experience to prevent this user error. Another example from last year is patient data exposure incident by the pharmacy company called AstraZeneca. So in this instance, developer credentials for AstraZeneca's internal server were left on GitHub for over a year and leaving sensitive patient data kind of exposed. So no one in this room is a stranger to cybersecurity risks, and a good user experience doesn't always mean making the user's job like as easy as possible, but it also is making sure that they can act and do things in a safe and reliable way to prevent situations like this. So this is an interesting example because obviously it was like human error of leaving credentials on a public forum like GitHub. But there's always like situation or things that we can do with the user experience to kind of prevent user error like that. So we're going to watch another quick clip. As we do, think of some ways that we could have prevented these user errors through like a different user interaction. And I might have to reshare again. Oh, and
So in the past, I've shown you a couple of examples of what happened. Origin of this video, those ideas, was this book excerpt I received from one of the viewers a few weeks ago, Where Men Win Glory. And the short basic premise of the book is that a lot of deaths in war situations, in Afghan war and or other wars around it, are caused by a friendly fire. But the excerpt I received actually hits the note on the human errors. What happens when you don't really invest in UX, when you design solutions?
The latter accident occurred during a desperate firefight between the Taliban and American Special Forces. An inexperienced Air Force tactical air controller had just calculated the coordinates of an enemy fighting position and was about to call in an airstrike when the batteries died in his precision GPS device, causing its display screen to go dark. Frantically, the air controller put new batteries into the GPS. The numbers flashed back on the screen a moment later, and he directed the B-52 flying overhead to drop its lethal payload on these coordinates. The air controller was unaware, however, that after a battery replacement, his GPS automatically defaulted to display the coordinates of its own position. He mistakenly called in these coordinates instead of the Taliban's position, and the upshot was...
And besides the book itself, there also has been coverage from actual media publications. For example, Times Magazine covered it as well.
December 5th, 2001, 2 months after the U.S. invasion, a massive 2,000-pound bomb killed 3 U.S. Special Forces north of Kandahar. The GPS-guided weapon struck the Americans because the controller on the ground, who called in the airstrike, changed the battery on his GPS device in the middle of the bombing run. But he didn't realize that once the unit rebooted, the aim point it began transmitting to the B-52 bomber far above wasn't the enemy's location, it was his.
And what threw me off here, the blame was given to the user, to the actual person who used that device, even if that device was not designed properly. For example, in the first one, you said inexperienced controller, right? Inexperienced operative. And in the second one, the journalist almost hints at it that the actual controller didn't realize. And that language alone kind of threw me off because they're almost stating that, hey, it's a user error. It's not actual experience error or a product or a service error. One of those examples is also 3 Mile Island accident of a nuclear meltdown, which happened in the late 70s in Pennsylvania, US.
Frank, it was an accident at the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant, which is located on an island in the Susquehanna River, 10 miles from Harrisburg.
Officials say some 50 to 60,000 gallons of radioactive water escaped into the reactor building, and that the radioactivity penetrated the plant's walls. This is what reactor number 2's control room looked like last September when it was still undergoing testing. But the company's statements have not answered several important questions.
And if you even would jump, let's say, in the actual Wikipedia article, it's basically states that mechanical failures are compounded by initial failure of plant operators to recognize the situation as a loss of coolant accident due to inadequate training, one. Second, and human factors, as human-computer interaction design oversights relating to ambiguous control room indicators in the power plant's user interface. This is a mouthful, right? But it's almost attributing the poor UX, which wasn't considering of a proper training, proper, consideration of the human factors, the perception of the actual control instruments. And on a very high level, what happened really was that the light which indicated if a valve was on or off was partially open and the users couldn't tell. And that oversight led to partial meltdown. And Don Norman, the UX grandfather, also said about this accident that the control room and computer interface at the 3 Mile Island could have not been more confusing if they had tried. And there's a lot of, knock-on effects here and there, which cause a lot of cancer cases. There has been a lot of dismissal of that because it's not statistically, adequate. But of course, there is a massive ripple effect, which if not detected on time, or even if not remediated properly, could cause even bigger, massive outbreaks. What happened, let's say, in Europe with Chernobyl accident. And additionally, another quote which hits the nail on its head is that pinning the blame on a person may be a comfortable way to proceed, but why was this system ever designed so that a single act by a single person could cause calamity? Worse, blaming the person without fixing the root underlying cause does not fix the problem. The same error is likely to be repeated by someone else.
So I think that quote there really stood out to me. Is that like, why could a single person cause through a single act cause such calamity, right? So in the chat, what are some things that you think could have been different about those user experiences, like in the examples we just watched, that could have prevented that user error? A warning banner, right? Anything else? Any ideas?
So Morgan, from the B-52 side of some of that stuff, we added so many other like restrictions, other checklist items to our stuff to make sure that that doesn't happen. That some of it like lengthen the process from, hey, worst case scenario, confirm that these are your coordinates and everything else.
Yeah, that's great insight. Thanks, Blackjack.
Yeah, that example is actually very close to my heart as well, because obviously my job, but I've heard that story, I can't tell how many times, but the Dagger, the GPS system that he was using actually has a warning now after you reboot it that it's displaying your own position, and it's because of that incident. Granted, the Dagger is still definitely not user friendly, but they at least started that out of it.
Yeah, great insight. Thank you both. It definitely puts it into perspective, like the gravity of the products that we develop in the DoD, right? We talked about how our user is very unique. They're dealing with high stress situations with high stakes on the line. And every decision we make can, like, no matter how seemingly insignificant it seems, could have like catastrophic effects, like, loss of life. So like, UCD is not foolproof. It's impossible to test and plan for every single edge case that could arise, but diligent testing and like keeping the user in the process, it just greatly reduces the chances that these edge cases are going to result in such catastrophic, effects, especially from like a poor design or like a user error. So I think a good quote here and like the key takeaway I want to cover from like these examples that we highlighted is every experience is designable, from software that coordinates refueling to the layout of a cockpit to the structure of a briefing. Everything can be designed intentionally with the user in mind. So if I haven't convinced you yet, I'm kind of like the UCD importance. I wanted to highlight some statistics that really stood out to me. One being every dollar invested in UX brings $100 in return. So this is an ROI of 9,900%, which is staggering. Another is that Staples did a research-driven site redesign. They saw an 80% increase in the number of visitors, 45% reduction in drop-off rates, and a 67% increase in repeat customers, just by having their site be kind of more usable and like more geared to the user. The cost of fixing an error after development is 100 times that of fixing it before development, as well as developers spend 50% of their time on avoidable rework. And the key takeaway I want to cover here too is the more we reduce the risk of kind of this rework or these like errors in development by doing the user research upfront and using UCD throughout our process, it allows us to spend more time on features that are impactful and that sort of thing. So last kind of section here is I want to cover like UCD and the DoD specifically. So the Data Society is a DC-based data science and training solution company, and they provide data science training and solutions to corporations and government agencies. And they did a report in 2021 about user experience in the Air Force. Two key takeaways from that report that I want to highlight here that they found is that when UX is not incorporated in every stage, the outcome often does not deliver the results that are needed by the warfighter, which is a theme we've talked a lot about today, is like, no matter what you do, if you're not doing that frequent incremental testing, it's just always going to end up not quite right. Not always, but the risk of it is higher. And that UX must be instilled as a mindset, which requires an intentional shift in systemization of UX principles across the Air Force. And I think this drives home the point that like UX and UCD, user-centered design, is not limited to designers. You don't need a designer on your team for this to be instilled within your development process. It's a mindset. It's a series of techniques that can be used for any problem. So what tasks are you facing right now that you could approach with UCD? I'm curious to hear examples of kind of what you're facing at the moment. I'm going to go over some examples, but while I do, kind of think of some examples of things you're dealing with and throw those in the chat. So one that I want to highlight is understanding if user can navigate a tool or process. I think it's really common in highly regulated areas like the DoD to often hear that there is a training problem, so that users don't know how to use a tool or a system because they haven't been trained on how to use it. I think there's some validity in this. The fact that we're building complex systems that, no matter what we do, there's going to need some training required. But if we do our due diligence to run usability tests and improve areas of poor usability, our warfighters can spend less time training on how to use the tool and actually using the tool to do their job effectively. So doing that usability testing and making our tools as usable as possible reduces the time training and increases the time actually doing the job. Another example is building a slide deck brief, something I'm sure we've all had to do at one point. The suggestion I have for this is running like 3 to 5 user interviews to understand the information that's most necessary to include in your slide can make your brief more effective and reduce risk of unnecessary effort on like information that's not as useful. That one's pretty straightforward. And then finally, like I said, training can be reduced with good usability, but sometimes it's kind of a necessary evil if our products are so complex that it's needed. But doing contextual inquiry, which, like I said previously, is going in person and observing your users, can help you identify things that are like the most important to include in training materials and help them do their job better, so we can train our people more effectively and efficiently. Cool. So to close us out, I want to touch on one risk with user-centered design, which is when it turns into user-driven design, which is a different thing. So user-driven design is where you basically are talking to users and just going and building whatever they tell you to build. So when we approach a problem, it's important to recognize that the user is the expert of what is, like they understand their world better than anyone. And you, as the person building the product, is the expert of what is possible. This is kind of what I mentioned when Adam brought this up previously. So there's a myth that user-centered design creates this like mental box, this dictatorship of user feedback that prevents us from being innovative. But this isn't necessarily true if UCD is done properly. So illustrated by this quote from Henry Ford, I know there's controversy on whether he actually said this, but I think the sentiment still stands. That if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. So, people at the time had no idea that an automobile was even a thing of possibility, right? So putting the user at the center doesn't mean that you're bound by the feedback you get, that you ask them what to build and just go do it. It's also doesn't excuse you from thought or innovation. The magic happens when you build, or is not when you build whatever the user tells you, but when you understand what the user needs and you marry that up with what you know to be possible. And that's where you kind of create that true innovation. So in conclusion, user-centered design puts the user at the center of the process. It reduces risk, and it is a mindset and technique that can be applied to any problem that you face. So any questions or thoughts? Anything that came up?
How does having a designer on your team or implementing user design, user-centered design help with like expediting the software delivery process?
Yeah, that's a great question. So typically with the software delivery process, right? A designer is working ahead of the developers. So they are like talking to users, identifying the next pain, they're designing a solution, and they're doing this all ahead of like the actual development. So features that are in flight have already been validated by users. So this helps like expedite the process because designers can do all of that trial and error, like those incremental loops that we were talking about before the developers even start coding. So as they work ahead, you know that like the next feature going into the backlog or going into the hands of the developers is already validated. It's what the user needs. It's never, not never, but oftentimes it's not perfection. Like when it actually goes out into live software, you still need to evaluate it and iterate upon it, but it really reduces those chance of like building something that the user doesn't need or is unusable. So that's kind of how it can help expedite the process. This is a hard thing. It's not a hard thing to do without a designer, but it's much easier with a product designer. However, a development team or anyone in the process can still do that user research. It's essentially doing an iteration of what you plan to build before you actually build it. So that way, you know, kind of what is needed. Does that make sense, Troy?
Yes, thank you.
Cool.
Hey Morgan, I got a question. Like when
Yep.
you're looking at like let's say either taking on software projects that need revamped or things that need software to replace them, how are you gonna focus this? Thinking about user-centered design versus user-driven design, where you're potentially replacing a product that may be out there.
That's a really tricky thing to tackle for sure. I think it's really easy, especially when an existing product exists already, to just, you know, start to rebuild the features that it already has and users are used to. I think this is where like contextual inquiry can really be huge, where you're like watching them use it, watch where they're running into issues, learning from usability problems of the existing system, but also there's a lot of techniques you can do to like reimagine the user's process, kind of without tools involved, to kind of like reimagine what it could look like. It's definitely a hard problem to solve. I would say like evaluating the existing tools for like usability, and contextual inquiry as to like observing the user's process, and then kind of using that to like start defining where you want this new tool to begin, can be helpful. But there's other techniques as well that can assist with that. But it's definitely, I would say, like, it's way harder to take an existing system than to just start with nothing and go from scratch.
Morgan, can I add here too? When you think about like big legacy systems, there are like a number of patterns to tackle those, but they're all like have a good relationship with each other. As an example, we can use user-centered design and related approaches in these things to uncover the parts of a large system that are still valuable going forward, because oftentimes these big things just become kind of behemoths over time and only small portions of them are actually valuable to users. Our approaches to user research can help us uncover what those things are, and that can inform architectural decisions that allow us to break these big systems up and prioritize how we tackle those. And just a quick plug, we're doing like a small group session tomorrow, Blackjack, with you and Major Mobley, on domain-driven design, which is the second part of that, about how we think about how architectures can be broken up and related to each other based on bounded contexts. And being able to couple that with, you know, user-centered approaches like Morgan's been talking about allows you to really marry that out in a nice way and not separate. It's like a kind of cohesive, holistic approach. So if anybody on the line is interested to learn more about domain-driven design, we have a session tomorrow that you're welcome to join. Just reach out to somebody on the line here and we can get you the information. But I think it's like a number of different lenses to approach those types of topics, I guess.
Yeah, definitely well said, Adam. Thanks. Any other questions?
Not to call anyone out, but I was really excited and I invited Captain Martinez and Mr. Hanks to this design workshop. So why I invited you guys is because I think it's very applicable to like the fact that we have a whole training flight for like IMOM and DICE. So just curious to see if you think that this is something that'd be applicable to the programs that you guys are running, if implemented. If you have voice comms, I don't know if you have it or not.
No, Mike, that's all right.
Okay, cool.
Cool. Yeah, thank you both for joining. It's really, yeah, really appreciate the time. Cool. Okay, to close us out here, I just want to do a quick plug. So the follow-up to this session today is we're doing a workshop on Thursday at 9 a.m. Central. And the kind of prompt for that is bring one problem, task, or assignment that you're working through right now. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating a user interview script and actually doing like a mock or user interview with folks that are on the line. So you can actually run like real user research in that call. We're also going to be doing a live, if we have time, a live usability test. So you can kind of see how that is run as well. If you can't think of an example of something to bring with you, that's okay. I'll have some example scenarios as well to work through. So that's a quick plug for that on Thursday. And then I also have additional reading resources that we can make available to all of you that are on the call. Cool. Thank you all for your time and joining. I'll stay on the line for the next 7 minutes if anyone else has questions, but we can kind of call it here for anyone that needs to drop.
Thanks, Morgan.
Thank you.
Thanks, Morgan.